I'd like to talk to you about Cyril Mann, who in his 6 decades of painting really made a unique contribution to 20th century British art. Since his death in 1980, his reputation has soared, and this year, to mark the centenary of his birth, Piano Nobile Gallery is mounting an exhibition of his works. Throughout his career, Cyril painted in a number of different styles, which for him were ultimately one development. But I think a good place to start is this work from 1950, Light and Shadow, which for him was a visual manifesto of what he was trying to achieve. It reflects in one all the different aspects of his works, from the early 1930s right through to his death. In so many of Cyril's works, he paints into the light or into the sun. This gives his work a distinct and original vision. Cyril was born in London in 1911, but grew up in Nottingham, and even from a young age he was a bit of a prodigy when it came to painting. He was the youngest boy ever to be accepted into the Nottingham School of Art with a scholarship at the age of 12. He painted this picture, Dark Satanic Mills, when he was 14. The title comes from Blake, and the work is a comment on society at the time. Even from this early age, his use of light and shadow is apparent. Influenced by the writings of D.H. Lawrence, Mann presents a vision of the privileged few playing happily in sunlight, while the workers trudge in the shadows to dark satanic mills. Mann uses light and shadow to dramatise the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. At 16, Cyril Mann emigrated to Canada to find work. Inspired by the vast landscape and Arthur Lismer, a leading member of the Canadian group of 7 artists, he started painting again. Lismer persuaded Cyril to return to England and continue his study of art. In 1931, Mann arrived back in England. Unemployed and on the dole, his luck turned after he was discovered by a priest who persuaded the wealthy art patron Erica Marks to set up a trust fund that enabled him to study at the Royal Academy schools. Mann hated the Academy and often said it took him 30 years to unlearn everything he had been taught there. He left the RA after 3 years, and still sponsored by Erica Marks, in 1937 went to study in Paris at Le Grand Chaumier under the Scottish colourist J.D. Fergusson. This watercolour of Paris again shows his fascination with the sun. An unusual Parisian scene, it has more of a feel of the industrial north of England than of Paris. Pont Neuf is one of the most successful pictures from this period.
This was done in Paris before I was born, even in 1937, when he was a student there. And it shows you the Pont Neuf, a very highly romanticized sort of view of it. Some fishermen along the banks of the Seine, and of course looking against the sun. Reflections here, there's a boat in front, but you see the mast, and it's still very much a scene that you would see in Paris today. And my husband very modestly inscribed it as, "This is my first masterpiece." Now, I have not actually shown this picture, and he hasn't shown this picture until we had this exhibition. So it's been unseen for 75 years or so. And it's very hard to believe that, you know, this very tranquil, very romantic scene, 2 years later, Cyril would be in the army fighting the war, and Paris would be overrun by the Germans.
Cyril spent the Second World War in the Royal Artillery and did not resume painting until the war had ended. His new work focused on the damage London had suffered, ruined buildings and bomb sites. This 1948 work shows the sun and smog of London and looks towards St Paul's and the church towers and buildings of the city. The large bomb site that sprawls across the image documents something of the destruction that London experienced in the war. Today this is the site of the Barbican and the Museum of London. The whole work really encompasses a wonderful feel of the age, with these rather hunched, solemn figures on their way to their destinations. There's beautiful tones, highlights of light from the sun, although you have this rather subdued atmosphere hitting what is obviously a wet street, and this wonderful drain cover here. Highlights on the metal, and of the car driving away in the distance, with the light reflecting off its roof, almost illuminating the street behind. Another wonderful example of Cyril's technical ability is how he portrays these figures in the foreground, with such economic brushwork, yet they have such a convincing feel. The leg of this gentleman here, which twists up from the pavement, really gives the movement that would be found in a walking figure. Painting into the sun, Mann greatly reduces the colours seen, painting with a limited palette but high tonal contrast. This particular work was exhibited at Wildenstein Gallery in 1948 for an exhibition they had for modern British artists. Unfortunately at the time it didn't sell, but I think partly being of a bomb site wasn't really what people were after. Nonetheless, this never really distracted Cyril from his artistic vision, and although he didn't sell many works in his lifetime, I think it shows dedication to his cause. Here is another example of one of Cyril's late 1940s works, a street scene in central London, this one entitled Wilson Street. Again, painting into the sun, Cyril is really trying to capture the contrast between light and shadow, giving it a very monochromatic feel, almost like a nocturne. These pictures are considered some of his finest and rarest works. Continuing into the 1950s, Cyril Mann started painting his bomb site pictures with the sun behind him, and in doing so, broadened his palette. Although many of Cyril's pictures from around 1948 seem to be quite monochromatic, I think this is a wonderful example of his use of colour when he wants to. Cooled, sunny morning in Finsbury, it shows a street scene with a radiant sun reflecting down into the street below. Fantastic use of primary colours to represent the sky and the buildings, vibrant reds, and the sun is painted in a blue, intense blue, white light. Painting light to Cyril was so important, but unlike Turner or the Impressionists, for him it was about bouncing light as it striked and reflected off surfaces. Light and shadow has a focal point of brilliant light that illuminates the rest of the picture. A huge shaft of light shines down from the centre, bouncing off the floor and other objects, reflecting around the image. Here Mann displays his technical ability to show that light is in constant movement. We see the reflective light and the opposite of light, which for him was shadow. At the bottom you have figures, which hint to his later 1950s works. Not only did Mann paint the base of the shadow, but he painted the entire volume, extending from the object, or figure, to the floor. Once again, this shows his tendency to use heightened contrast where he felt it appropriate. He called this his solid shadow period. In the 1950s, Cyril's surrounding environment once again had an immediate influence on his painting. In the early 1950s, Cyril moved into a bricked-up council flat that had no daylight. When he switched on the electric light, it changed his perception of the objects in front of him, making the shadows more prominent. This prompted him to explore solid shadow formations. Dahlias in a blue vase, circa 1955, with the shafts of shadows below the flowers, is a good example of this. This was an entirely new style for Cyril Mann, but it only lasted 3 years. Concentrating on small still lifes and everyday objects, his approach became analytical and disciplined, using intensified colour and strong line on flat surfaces. It's hard to believe these paintings were done 60 years ago, because they're not unlike works that Andy Warhol, Patrick Corfield and even Michael Craig Martin produced decades later. The next decade saw a dramatic change from his work of the 1950s. In 1959, Mann met and married Renske van Slooten, a Dutch-Indonesian girl, 28 years his junior. She became his muse, giving him and his work a new lease of life. For the first time, his financial pressures disappeared. Renske supported him so he could paint full-time in their council flat. Cyril always said that working away from home in a studio would make him lose all inspiration. This work offers an insight into his home and working conditions. For the first time, Mann could paint larger and looser canvases with more extravagant use of paint. He enjoyed textures and often painted with the coarsest brushes he could find on rough Hessian rather than canvas, completing them in a matter of hours as he followed the sunlight around the room. It is almost as if shadow vanishes as his works become a crescendo of bouncing light. Every highlight in Reclining Nude 2 of 1963 seems to have a visible ray of light bouncing off it. Throughout his life, Cyril painted self-portraits. This one is the last, completed a year before his death. He paints himself in the nude, smoking a cigarette, flanked by two earlier self-portraits. By calling the work Ecce Homo, he alludes to the crucifixion of Christ, with the self-portraits representing the two thieves. Cyril lived his life for art and endured bouts of severe manic depression, which led to several periods in Claybury Mental Hospital. Although bitter at his lack of recognition, the defiant face on the canvas shows that he never doubted the contribution he had made to 20th century painting.